For this assignment, we're looking at cellular respiration, which is how cells harvest chemical energy. The basic reaction looks like this. You have C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus many ATPs. We'll go over the specifics of this reaction throughout the PowerPoint. It's important for you to know that breathing and cellular respiration are related. When you breathe, you bring oxygen into your lungs. The oxygen goes through the bloodstream to all of your cells, and in those cells, cellular respiration happens. As respiration takes oxygen from what you breathe in and sugar from the food you eat, it produces energy. One of the other products of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide, of course, has to leave your body. So it goes from the muscle cells back to your lungs through your bloodstream and then out of your body. Respiration is a series of reactions where fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, mostly glucose, are broken down into make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The fats, the proteins, and the carbohydrates are the macromolecules that we learned about earlier that your body requires in order to do a variety of processes, one of them being respiration. Another look at the reaction. The C6H12O6 is the glucose. Remember that glucose is a carbohydrate. O2 is oxygen gas, and it yields CO2, which is carbon dioxide, H2O, which is water, and ATP, which is the energy molecule. Recall that chemical reactions have two parts. They have reactants. These are the ingredients needed for the reaction to happen. In this case, the reactants are glucose and oxygen gas. A chemical reaction also has products. These are the things produced by the reaction. In our cellular respiration reaction, the products are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. In any chemical reaction, they're separated by an arrow that points toward the products. It tells you which direction the reaction is running. Here's an overview of cellular respiration. The reactions proceed the same way in both plants and animals, and that process is called respiration. The overall reaction looks like what we've seen. In this reaction, transformation of chemical energy in food turns into the chemical energy that cells can use in the molecule called ATP. ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate. And this is what that molecule would look like. It has three parts. It has a phosphate group, which you can see are phosphate atoms linked with oxygen atoms. It has a ribose group, which is also a sugar, and it has an adenine group, which is a nucleic acid. In ATP, the energy is actually stored in the bonds between these last two phosphate groups. Most of the energy from cellular respiration is converted into this molecule. This molecule, or ATP, is a substance that powers most cell activities. You get energy by breaking the bond between the last two phosphates of ATP. So the energy is released when this bond is broken through other chemical reactions. So how does this happen? First, you need an enzyme to break the bond. That enzyme is called ATPase. This enzyme makes ATP into a DP. It turns the triphosphate into a diphosphate, which means it took away one phosphate atom. To remake ATP, another enzyme is used. This is called ATP synthetase. Continuing with our overview, the breakdown of glucose, which we know is a carbohydrate, begins in the cytoplasm outside of the mitochondria. Glucose breaks down into smaller molecules, and these enter the liquid matrix inside the mitochondria to be broken down again. Take a look at the next slide and locate the matrix. You can see the matrix is this liquid part in the center of the mitochondria. The folds, which are membrane folds, that you see here, those are called the cristae. and that's another important part of cellular respiration. But back to the matrix. This is where 3 carbon pieces called pyruvate that came from carbohydrates are broken down into carbon dioxide and water. The cristae is where the ATP is actually formed. So in the liquid matrix in between the folds, that's where you have further breaking down. And then in the cristae, which are the folds, that's where you have the ATP production. Respiration needs to be broken down into several stages. The first stage is the breakdown of glucose. That stage is called glycolysis. In glycolysis, glucose is broken down into pyruvate which makes a little bit of ATP. So here we have a molecule of glucose. In stage 1, we use an NAD. We turn an NAD plus into an NADH and an ADP into ATP. So we get a little bit of ATP here. And we turn that glucose, which is a 6th carbon molecule, into 2 3-carbon molecules. This actually happens outside of the mitochondrion, in the cytoplasm, floating around inside the cell. The pyruvate can then go one of 2 ways. It either goes through aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration. These 2 different paths. At this point, life diverges into 2 forms and 2 pathways. You've got anaerobic cellular respiration, also known as fermentation, and you've got aerobic cellular respiration. We'll look at anaerobic respiration first, which is again called fermentation. In this process, glucose gets broken down into pyruvate. Then, if there is no oxygen present, we have the pyruvate going through a process called fermentation, which produces ethanol or lactic acid. Some organisms thrive in environments with little to no oxygen. These would be things like bacteria. These places include marshes, bogs, the intestines and the gut of animals, including humans, and sewage treatment ponds. There's no oxygen in these places. So no oxygen is why we use the term anaerobic. An means without. It results in no more ATP. Remember, we did produce a little bit of ATP during glycolysis. And the final steps in these pathways serve only to regenerate NAD+, so it can return to pick up more electrons and hydrogens in glycolysis. The end product, such as ethanol, carbon dioxide, in single-cell fungi called yeast, to make beer or to make bread, or lactic acid, like in muscle cells. Fermentation is when oxygen is not present, and it follows glycolysis, which regenerates the NAD+ needed for glycolysis to continue. Fermentation happens in the production of things like beer, also yogurt, cheese, etc. Lactic acid fermentation is when pyruvate is converted to lactate, which is what makes your muscles burn when you exercise. So that's one pathway that glucose can take in an organism. If oxygen is required, that's called aerobic cellular respiration. This has 2 more sets of reactions which occur in a specialized structure within the cell called the mitochondria. Those sets of reactions are the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Remember, the first step for either aerobic or anaerobic respiration is glycolysis. So now on to stage 2, the production of ATP. In the Krebs cycle, you have a series of reactions that produce energy-storing molecules during aerobic respiration. During the electron transport chain, large amounts of ATP are actually turned in or are made during this process. The Krebs cycle is also known as the citric acid cycle. This completes the breakdown of glucose. So you have glucose starting to be broken down during glycolysis, and then it moves into the Krebs cycle where it's further broken down. It takes those pyruvate molecules, which are made of 3 carbon atoms, and break them down. The carbon and oxygen atoms end up in carbon dioxide and water. The hydrogens and the electrons are stripped and loaded onto 2 coenzymes called NAD+ and FAD. And when you add the hydrogens to those, you get NADH, H for hydrogen, and FADH2. This part of the cellular respiration process only produces 2 more ATP, but it loads up the coenzymes with hydrogen ions and electrons, which move into the 3rd stage where the majority of the ATP is made. So here we have glycolysis, breaking down glucose into pyruvate. It happens out in the cytoplasm, and you get some ATP. Glycolysis moves into the citric acid cycle, where you get a little bit more ATP produced, but more importantly, you get those 2 coenzymes, which are used in the next step. Next step called the electron transport chain. The electron carriers are loaded with electrons and protons from the Krebs cycle, move to this chain-like series of steps, which is kind of like a staircase. As electrons drop down the stairs, energy is released to form a total of 32 ATP. Oxygen is waiting at the bottom of the staircase to pick up the electrons and protons, and in doing that, it becomes water. So here we have the 3rd step. Glycolysis produces a little bit of ATP and produces some electrons, which get carried over into the last step. Citric acid cycle produces a little bit of ATP, but more importantly produces the coenzymes NADH and FADH2. Those coenzymes go into the electron transport chain, where you have the majority of the ATP being made. Let me show you how the electron transport chain works. In this process, you have a series of compounds localized within the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. So here we have, this is a close-up view of the mitochondrion. We have the outer membrane, and then we have the inner membrane, which, as we learned earlier, is called the cristae, and then you have the liquid part, which is the matrix. So if we zoom in on the cristae, we have a bunch of proteins set in place within the membrane. The electron transport chain is a series of compounds localized within the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. Let's take a look at one of those coenzymes, NADH, and what happens to it in the electron transport chain. You can see the electron moving down the staircase, linking up with oxygen to become water. FADH2 moves those electrons again, links up with oxygen at the end to become more water. And lastly, the protons link up with another phosphate group to form ATP. So let's tally up the total amount of energy that we've seen so far. 36 ATP molecules are produced during aerobic respiration, compared to only 2 ATP molecules for anaerobic respiration, otherwise known as fermentation. Glycolysis produces 2 ATP, the Krebs cycle produces another 2 ATP, and the electron transport chain produces 32 ATP for a total of 36 ATP. This is if your cell has oxygen present. However, if the cells don't have oxygen present, you can still produce a little bit, which is perfect for bacteria. They're tiny little creatures. They don't require much energy at all. And they live in areas where oxygen is not present. Anaerobic organisms, therefore, can't be too energetic, but they're extremely important for the recycling of carbon throughout the globe. So here is the entire process. Glycolysis, glucose turns into pyruvate, gives you 2 ATP. Gives you also 2 NADH, which we know are important coenzymes. The next step, citric acid cycle, runs and produces 2 more ATP. Also produces some more NADH and FADH2, those coenzymes, along with the ones from glycolysis, move over here to the electron transport chain, and then you get 32 or 34 more ATP molecules. So to recap, cellular respiration is a metabolic process, sort of like burning fuel. It releases much of the energy that is stored in food, and it makes an energy molecule called ATP. That ATP molecule provides cells with the energy they need to carry out the activities of life, such as muscle movement, or sending nerve impulses throughout your body, or doing active transport to bring in or move out other molecules into your cells. The basic formula is C6H12O6 plus O2 yields CO2 plus H2O plus ATP. It's really important to remember that respiration works opposite of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis brings in light energy and turns it into organic molecules plus oxygen. It turns it into glucose. The mitochondrion takes that glucose, breaks it down, and produces CO2 and water. Carbon dioxide and water are used during photosynthesis. The products of respiration are used as the reactants for photosynthesis. The products of photosynthesis are used as the reactants for respiration. This brings us to the end of our cellular respiration assignment. If you have any questions, please send me a message.